Hey there, I'm Kat, and today I'm going to be talking about how our product uses or challenges conventions and how it represents social groups or issues. So, the genre of the sequence that my group and I have created is a slasher horror, which has a multitude of genre conventions, those being techniques or tropes often found within a specific genre. In order to demonstrate how my group and I have used or challenged conventions of slasher horror, I'm going to be comparing our product to the films Halloween from 1978, Scream, the TV show Slasher, and the video game Dead by Daylight. So, editing conventions. We kept our pacing fairly slow initially within the sequence, and then progressively cut quicker and quicker as the intensity built within it. This created a slow, agonizing pace to build tension, and then a payoff in release to fit the loss of control and chaoticism of the woman's death. That's mostly all there is to editing horror conventions, but in terms of titling, we used white striking font, which we transitioned initially fading, then cutting in, with progressively erratic placement. The white is unobtrusive, it keeps focus on the narrative, the font imposing and urgent, the transition helps with the pacing. As the sequence grows more chaotic, so does the transition, and the placement again symbolizes the increasing chaoticism of the sequence. Then on to sound. So, very fun. We had our non-diegetic crow sound cue, which effectively functions as a leitmotif within the sequence. First of all, it's a disjointed, unnerving sound, but it also subtly establishes a sound cue to create horror by linking it to the killer.
He can't kill the boogeyman.
Get in there, come on, Tommy! Now lock the door!
This usually only links in later in a film, of course, but regardless, it still creates horror here and is useful to bear in mind for adhering to genre conventions. We also had a non-diegetic soundtrack under our sequence. Similarly, they're used as leitmotifs for the killer throughout the film. Here, we really just use it to establish an immediate sense of unease and discordance within the sequence, even when nothing wrong has necessarily occurred. Discordance which only increases musically as the sequence progresses. It just acts as parallel sound to complement the image. In terms of sound effects, we really only have them when the foot is crushed. It's used to accentuate the horror of the scene through a repulsive noise to fit an action. It's usually pretty squishy, or in our case, crunchy with the toes. Then onto camera, we ensure to keep a low angle on the killer, at least for his reveal, which creates a sense of him being intimidating, something to be feared more than human. Clearly this creates horror for the killer. Then we have large amounts of space within the composition as well. This creates a sense of unease regarding the amount of sort of uncomfortable empty space, which especially creates a sense that something is lurking, waiting for the woman, which of course it is. Then static camera, we especially modeled this after Halloween. It creates a sense of feeling confined, trapped within the confines of the frame, just as the victim is trapped in their own homes. Finally, onto mise-en-scène. We had dark lighting, seen as it was set at night. Naturally, this helps create horror through uncertainty of what could be lurking. In terms of props, the only prop here is really the weapon, a hammer. We will come back to this one later when we're talking about social groups. Very interesting. But in terms of regular mise-en-scène, this had to be a unique weapon, not strongly linked to any killer, in order to create a more memorable, unique killer for our sequence. It establishes the killer as its own being for the audience, not just a B-movie ripoff of something else. This is vital for attracting a target audience and having the sequence be taken seriously. Then costume, hair, and makeup. The mask dehumanizes the killer, naturally, thus making him more threatening and less potentially sympathetic in any sense. The black for the killer, it allows him to show up much darker on camera, therefore arise from the darkness, implicating he's been watching her for an unspecified period of time. It also helps connote death, of course. Blue for the woman, the calming blue contrasts with the total violence within the sequence, serving to counterpoint it and thus make her comfort feel breached, and consequently allow the audience to share in this. She doesn't have white in order to suggest she has some degree of control. She isn't entirely innocent and vulnerable, but yet is still easily overcome by the killer, helping to increase the horror. No, the white is saved for the fiancé, who is absolutely entirely vulnerable, which the white connotes he dies as soon as he lives. So, character introduction. Our characters are introduced in a massively vulnerable state. They're sleeping. This therefore sets up their vulnerability for the rest of the sequence. They're not very characterized outside of this because they are quote-unquote bait victims created to establish the killer as a threat. Now, bait victims are my name for characters that get killed at the start of slash films as a way to establish the killer as a threat. So, narrative in terms of opening sequence, same thing. It's just about establishing the killer as a threat. It can also help to establish location though, so our film is set at a house, so therefore the rest of the film going to be set around the town the house is in. Now, on to social groups. So, we have two key social groups which we're representing, that is within gender and within age. So, in terms of gender, we mostly adhere to stereotypes. So, very typical of the slasher genre, bait victims are usually female. They find the killer after their partner has been killed. This creates a sick sense of horror in that sexuality is almost perverted. Someone who they cared deeply about, or at least were physically intimate with, is murdered for no reason other than to quote-unquote taunt the female victim and pervert the idea of embracing sexuality, particularly female sexuality, into a violent act. To elaborate, for example, the hammer, the weapon, becomes a phallic object and essentially becomes a parallel of sex, which therefore creates the ultimate horror. Our most vulnerable state becomes something to be feared instead of enjoyed. Perversion of this normality into traumatic violence creates psychosexual horror. Having it done to women perhaps aids this through women traditionally being seen as more vulnerable and less physically able than men to fend for themselves. However, this clearly means women aren't portrayed all that well in traditional slasher horror media. I mean, we get killed for any sort of sexuality? Come on! I therefore tried to take this concept but turn it into something less frankly sexist and increase the age of the couple to emphasize the fact that their love is deeper than simply sexuality and help remove the sexist connotations often found in the slasher genre. It then becomes more of a psychosexual perversion of intimacy rather than sexuality. Despite that, by focusing on the woman and having her chase after her partner only to find the killer, I did still adhere to genre conventions, particularly exploiting how women are often seen as vulnerable. I more so just tried to strike a balance between adhering to conventions and the sexist undertones that can often carry with this genre. In terms of age, as discussed, we subvert stereotypes. So yeah, this was partially done to remove the sort of moral condemnation of female sexuality element often found in the slasher genre, but also done to turn the perversion of sexuality in the violence of the killer into the perversion of intimacy, as stated. Overall, though, I believe it allows her to be taken a little more seriously as a character rather than just an irritating caterwauling teenager, which helps place some genuine horror back into the sequence. It just allows it to have that little extra shift tonally to still keep the sequence fun by adhering to some conventions, but still keep actual horror there as well. So that about wraps it up, friends. I'll see you next time for question 2. Can't wait.